They were out early one morning, panning in the stream for gold, surrounded by the rising mountains. Old prospector with a tale for two, he brushed around in the pan, and pointing out what lay within was ordinary sand. He began with his story about 20 years before, and a younger man who sought his fortune. With a tear or two he told of searching for his treasure, but making known the gold he sought was ordinary pleasure. There were years of doing without, and there were years of plenty. He started thinking that life was never steady, excepting when the bills came in and he had no money to pay. Whiskey had never tasted better ordinarily. Concluded his story as it filled the air with a laugh, saying how he found the Lord and Savior, and how he found the river of life by which his day unfolds, and pointing out what stands within is not ordinary gold, and pointing out what stands within is not ordinary gold. Trust in God, believe upon His promises. Through His word we can see His wonders, signs and miracles of His love. We can return His love with devotion, standing on His word before all men. We are His beloved and His chosen, walking in this life renewed with peace. Trust in God, believe upon His promises. promises. Through His Word we can see His wonders, signs and miracles of His love. We can return His love with devotion, standing on His word before all men. We are His beloved and His chosen, walking in this life renewed with peace. Trust in God, believe upon His promises. Trust in God, believe upon His promises. Believe upon His promises.
Hello, hello, hello. I'm Mark Wallace. This is True North Studio, and today our topic is perfect words for an imperfect time. James and Jude. Well, the world had gone mad since the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the new Christians were paying the price. Times were hard, but times were deadly if you made waves. Waves were made. Doors were kicked down and entire screaming households of believers were being dragged out into the streets. Christians were being attacked by the Romans for being outspoken, for being different. But it wasn't just the Romans doing the hunting. The fledgling believers were also being viciously persecuted by the religious leaders of Judea for breaking away from the Old Testament way and talking about the Christ. The Judean religious leaders even took it upon themselves to hire mercenaries to attack those who broke away. Think Saul of Tarsus. The Romans allowed it to happen because they assumed that the Christians were the new enemies of Rome. So they jailed, slaughtered, or just ruined the lives of the disciples. Anything to get them to shut up about their Christ. Many of the believers who weren't killed for their beliefs left their homes, fled their cities, their farms, their families, their life. They scattered and the religious elite hunted them down like some kind of Hunger Game. Others just quietly melded back into polite society in order to avoid persecution. This same social silencing can be pulled from today's headlines. But a new type of attack had recently crept in through the back door. One that could destroy all that the Christ had lived and died for. It was sneaky. Like a cheap spy novel, some of the faithful believers were actually turned and began to work for the enemy. They would infiltrate and out their own Christian friends. Now the believers were beginning to turn on each other, and they were twisting the knife. The believers needed help and they needed it fast. They needed something to hang on to, something tangible to reflect on. They needed something to help them make it through the day. But for the first 10 bloody years of Christianity, they had nothing but the Old Testament, the day of Pentecost, and their memories about Jesus to guide them. They needed more. Enter James and Jude. During these troubling times is exactly when the first two letters, the first two epistles were inspired by God and written by James and Jude. The first two letters dealt specifically with how to strive and survive and thrive during the most dangerous and disturbing of times. Like those early Christians, we too suffer the aftershocks of war, riots, hate, separation, depression, fear, and natural disasters. We too feel the pain of an overreaching government, corrupt politicians, and prideful religious leaders. We too are getting sick and tired of self-appointed leaders demanding that we obey. People are on edge, and that's just in my neighborhood. But no matter how bad people treat us, no matter how corrupt our society and government has become, no matter who tries to mess with our beliefs or our family, we can handle it. We can handle it because James and Jude gave us the perfect words for an imperfect time. Who were James and Jude? Who were they? James and Jude were two of the four brothers of Jesus. Jesus had at least 6 or 7 siblings. He was not an only child. The brothers who wrote these first 2 letters and distributed them to the believers scattered all over around Israel were not chosen by Jesus to be 2 of the original 12 apostles. These men had not traveled and served with Jesus and his disciples during his earthly ministry. They were not there when Jesus walked on the water, not there when he raised the dead. They were not there when he healed the sick, nor were they there when he miraculously fed thousands of people. They were there when 12-year-old Jesus was scolded after his parents' frantic 3-day search for him when he ran away in Jerusalem. Now, if you've ever thought you lost a child at an amusement park or a large store, or when they ran away for a day or two, then you know what I'm talking about. Can you imagine losing the Christ? Can you imagine? Mary must have been freaking out. This was new. James and Jude smirked when they heard that Jesus had run away. But they found him after 3 days in the temple talking with the religious leaders. Luke 2:48, and when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. Well, Mary pulled 12-year-old Jesus to his feet and said, Jesus, your dad and I were losing our minds looking for you. Why would you do this to us? Well, the religious leaders took that as a good time to exit. Verse 49, and he, young Jesus, said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business? This is just what James and Jude wanted to hear. James smiled, looked at Jude, who was smirking, and said, What Father's business? Did Jesus go buy a lawnmower and a hammer? You know, James and Jude didn't get Jesus. They wouldn't for a very long time. But they were there when Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding up in Cana. They both enjoyed Jesus' first miracle. To them, at that wedding, their older brother Jesus was now officially a freak show. In fact, for most of Jesus' earthly life and ministry, these 2 brothers were embarrassed by him and thought that Jesus was a little bit crazy. When James and Jude were almost 30 years old, they once tried to force Jesus to stop teaching during a teaching. Mark 3:21, and when his friends or family heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him, for they said, He's beside himself, which means he's crazy. Not long after that, James and Jude even wanted Jesus dead. They wanted nothing to do with him. John 7:5 says, For neither did his brothers, believe in him. They didn't believe in him. But after the resurrection and ascension and the amazing events of the day of Pentecost, something changed in them. They finally understood what Jesus had been talking about. They both actually made him Lord. They finally believed God raised him from the dead. Their older brother Jesus was actually the Christ. It finally made sense to them. They'd been raised with the Messiah. How cool is that? Jude and James became believers. Now, why did people listen to James and Jude? Well, after Pentecost, James and Jude did things to help the brand new believers that even the apostles couldn't do. The early followers gravitated to James and Jude as much, if not more, than they did to the apostles. Why? Well, even the apostles deferred to James through much of Acts. Why? Well, maybe, like off-brand toys, both men probably moved like and maybe even resembled Jesus. They probably walked, talked, joked, and interacted with people similar to Jesus. They had gone to the same schools as Jesus, studied under the same rabbis as Jesus, and probably shared some of the same friends. Like Jesus, they also knew the apostles before they were apostles. One of the 12 apostles, Nathanael, was from Cana, where the water into wine miracle had happened. They had even worked in the same wood shop with Jesus' dad and probably repeated the same dad jokes, like, who's the greatest babysitter in the Bible? David. He rocked Goliath to sleep. Or how about this one? Need an ark? I know a guy. Get it? Noah? They'd been raised very similar to Jesus. Like the brothers of a famous Hollywood actor, they were sort of famous without having to do much of anything. Yet they did do something. They made a name for themselves. They carved out their own little piece of history. All the believers in Israel knew exactly who James and Jude were, especially the ones who had spent personal time with the Christ. But James and Jude were different than the apostles. They wrote God-inspired letters. Before that time, the apostles had written nothing. They didn't just stick around Jerusalem, they also visited the believers. Their 2 letters were the complete New Testament for the first 22 years of Christianity. Did you hear what I said? That was the entire New Testament, was the book of James and Jude. There was no one saying, it's Christ in you, yet. Nobody said, I can do all things through Christ who strengtheneth me. There was no exceeding abundantly above all that ye ask or think. There was not even one single gospel written yet. A mom could read the entire New Testament to her children in 30 to 40 minutes. There were no letters from Paul or Peter, no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, no book of Revelation to ponder. The letters of James and Jude were it. There was no book of Acts or 1 Corinthians 12 and 14 to help the disciples understand their gift. There was no book of Timothy to help them keep the faith all the while they're being viciously attacked. Paul, the greatest of the persecutors, had just recently become a brand new Christian, Acts 9. But Paul had not yet written a word. He was a spiritual babe at this time. The world would have to wait 10 more years for Paul to start writing. Jesus' favorite sidekick, Peter, had recently led some Gentiles or unbelievers into the power of the new birth, into speaking in tongues. And this totally upset the apple cart and blew the Judean believers' minds. That's Acts 10. It would be 20 more years before Peter started writing. James and Jude were written during the Acts 11 time frame, maybe 41 AD. The book of Jude and James were an early version of the doctrine, reproof, and correction that Paul implemented. Now you see why the brothers of Jesus, James and Jude, were crazy famous, even among the apostles. Now I know that some of you are saying, Mark, we were taught that the epistles of Jude and James are written to help the future believers after the gathering together during the tribulation. You're crazy, Mark. Well, then I ask you wide-margin Bible scholars, why were James and Jude's letters so widely spread around during the first 25 years of Christianity? Why did both Paul and Peter refer back to the letters of James and Jude in their epistles? There's something interesting. Here's something interesting. If you read 2 Peter and Jude side by side, you're going to see some amazing similarities. Don't even get me started on the similarities between Jude and the Timothy letters. If you read the book of James and Romans at the same time, you will see how Paul had the letter of James stuck firmly in his head. But 10 or 20 years later, Paul will take what James wrote to a whole new level. And we're all well aware of that. The short books of Jude and James must have dominated the thoughts and conversations of the early Christians for over 20 years. And those were some hard years for the believers. James and Jude taught the believers how to stay alive and stay blessed during the darkest of days. James and Jude shared the perfect words during imperfect times. The lesson of Jude. At 600 words, Jude is more of a one-page letter than an actual book. James's letter is a bit longer at 2,300 words. Together they could be read in less than an hour. Now I have to spend a bit more time on Jude than on James because it is so figurative, whereas James is simple and clear-cut. You know, both letters were written about the time of the great famine that devastated the entire Mediterranean, maybe 10 years after Pentecost. Acts 11:27 talks about this. And these days came the prophets from Jerusalem up to Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Now remember, the Romans blamed the Christians for the drought and famine. They did. The Romans blamed the Christians for that drought and the famine that happened. So they attacked them. Now, drought caused by lack of rain and extreme heat is not just a modern occurrence as our elite talkers want us to believe. All they drove back in the first century were donkeys. Okay? People were starving, broke, and desperate. And as you know, when people are desperate, they can do some pretty awful things to get what they want. Awful things were done. We're going to see another type of natural disaster that devastated the believers. Jude tells us how the greatest, most hurtful attack is not the weather. It will usually come from the people we allow into our lives. Jude 1:3. Beloved, when I give all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you, and exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. Jude really wanted to write about the joy of being born again, like James did. He calls it the common salvation. But deep down, Jude knew that he needed to write about the fight, he needed to write about earnestly contending for the faith. Okay, he had to write about that fight. At that time, things were tough in the Roman Empire, but times were deadly if you were a Christian. Jude will warn the disciples of another hidden danger that had already infiltrated their fellowships. And you're all going to recognize it. You've all seen it your whole ministry life, your whole life. Jude uses 4 examples in just 25 verses, but we're only going to look at one. Division was already beginning to happen within the new Christian fellowships. That's pretty sad. It's only 10 years. Jude 1:11, or Jude 11. Woe unto them, for they've gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Orig. First off, who is he talking to? He's talking to the believers here. Jude, the brother of Jesus, is actually describing how some of the believers acted. You've all been affected by these 3 types of people. People who will use us until they use us up. Verse 12. These are spots in your feasts of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. Without fear. A spot is a better translation is an underwater rock or reef that rips a hole in your boat. You start sinking before you even know what hit you. Think Titanic. My wife calls them dangerous people. Dangerous people. You all know that person at work or church or in your social group. The term a feast of charity or love feast was simply a fellowship that centered around the meal, sort of a potluck dinner. Back then, someone would send out a group text saying that dinner tonight was going to be at Susan's or Josie's or Tara's or Valeria's house. And oh, be sure to bring a sack supper. Jude may be here. Send. Now during the meal, someone would pick up a piece of bread like Jesus did at the Last Supper and remind everyone that the bread still represents how Jesus' body was broken for our healing. Then they would wash down that bread with a sip of wine or water. And then they would remind each other that the drink represented his blood that was shed for the forgiveness of our sins. The first century love feast was nothing like the highly scripted communion services we see in churches and ministries today. This feast of love happened every single time the believers got together. Plus, it's still supposed to be mentioned at every one of our meals, your meals at home. Read 1 Corinthians 11. Imagine if you told yourself that you're healed and forgiven every time you eat. Every time. You think you'd be more healthy? Back to that word spot in verse 12. That hidden reef that rips out the hull of your boat is warning us about people we eat with. These are believers. Everything about the person looks good on the surface, but there's danger underneath. You ever met somebody like that? And they are the most dangerous because they have the easiest access to you. Remember, they were in the middle of a famine. And remember that Christians were being hunted down. People were desperate. So why did Jude bring up Cain and Balaam and Corey? Who was Cain? What's the big deal about Balaam? Who even was Corey, and why should it matter? Well, this information may surprise you. It may even save your life. First, the way of Cain. Jude 11. Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. Now, we all know that Cain was the first child born to Adam and Eve. He received all their love and attention. They taught him right for wrong, talked about the mistakes they had made. They raised him to love God and acknowledge God. He grew into a great kid until he wasn't. Then Eve had a second son, Abel. The kid was really, really, really good. Now, Cain wasn't so happy about how well his younger brother, was doing. He didn't like it. Cain became jealous of how much his younger brother Abel loved and manifested God and God's power. He also hated how God blessed the kid. It drove Cain crazy. So Cain mocked him, ridiculed him, hated him, and ended up killing his own brother with his bare hands. This jealousy, this mockery, this disdain was a process. It took time. It all started with words he ruminated on and the words he used to disarm Abel. Now, here's what I need you to understand. To go the way of Cain does not necessarily mean to get born of the seed of the serpent like some of you have been taught. It can't. Seed of the serpent is a long, manipulative process. Plus, we all know that it's not even available for born-again believers anyway, because we have incorruptible seed, like 1 Peter 1:23 says, being born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible. So why is this Cain reference here? Why? Well, going the way or down the path of Cain is being jealous when somebody believes God for abundance or health better than you do. Better than you do. It's being envious of someone manifesting more godly power than you do. So you say things to hurt them. You secretly want them to fail, to not get healed because you didn't. Here's an example. I remember getting reproved on a national leadership conference call during a very hard time in a ministry I was once in. And this was also during an economic downturn in society. Well, Josephine and I were told to stop talking about how much God was blessing us and to stop talking about how the believers around us were prospering. Well, the ministry president basically told us to shut the what up because our success made other leaders feel bad. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo-hoo. I just shook my head. What? That's the way of Cain. The way of Cain begins with envy, jealousy, and resentment. Cain's brother, Abel, let his guard down around his brother, and it cost him his life. This is what Jude is talking about. If someone makes you feel small, stay away from them. If a believer or a family member makes you feel less, watch out. Keep your eyes open. The way of Cain is to make someone feel bad for doing good. I've experienced a Christian group that was like that. And anyone who outshined the favored leaders was shut down. And that's sad and frustrating, folks. That's the way of Cain. That's the way of Cain. We must be on guard when people are jealous of our walk with God. Their words could cost you your life. It's bullying at its best. They take you off your game little by little by little bit until you're a shell of who you once were. And then they control you and watch you die the death of 1,000 cuts. Warning number 1 is be aware of others who are jealous of your walk with God. They will steal your joy, shut down your gift, turn others against you, and try to get you to quit on God and dull your shine. It makes them feel big. That is the way of Cain. Now the error of Balaam. Jude 11. Woe unto them, for they have ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward. Now this is a good one. We've all seen this. Balaam, the talking donkey guy, was actually a prophet during the same time frame as Moses and Job. Did you know that? During the same time as Moses and Job, Balaam was around. Balaam and Job were not of Israel. They weren't the Hebrew people, yet they both had the Spirit of God and spoke for God. I ask you, could that still happen today? The children of Israel were about to enter the promised land, and the local kings didn't want to lose their land to these dag-blasted Hebrew people. So they hired Balaam, the world-famous prophet, to put a curse on Israel. And God told him not to do it. The donkey told him not to do it. The angel told him not to do it. He even told himself not to do it. Don't put a curse on Israel. But Balaam really wanted the money, needed the money. The king promised him. So Balaam got the idea that if he could somehow break down the morals of the believers, they would give up on God, not make it into the promised land, and he would get paid. He wouldn't even need to curse them. His plan was easy peasy. All he had to do was get a few of the young Hebrew studs to lust after the super sexy girls from Moab. And these girls would take the believer boys to church, if you know what I'm talking about. You know, the only thing the young Hebrew guys had to do was put up with a few babies being sacrificed, worship a few other gods, and then they got to have sex with the girls who were well trained in the fine art of ritual prostitution. These young men were panting like a dog. Once a few did the deed with these girls, it spread through the camps of Israel like wildfire. All the young men wanted to be doing this. You know, Balaam, rubbing his greedy little hands together, finally had dollar signs in his eyes. Boing! It took a plague and the death of many leaders and eventually a war before the problem that Balaam started was stopped. During times of famine or lack, we start looking a bit closer at what others have. Balaam wasn't jealous of the Hebrew people's connection with God like Cain was. He himself had the Spirit of God. And he was pretty darn good at using it too. The error of Balaam was greed. He became a prophet for hire. There's some of those today. Pay became his motivation. Balaam was willing to bend his morals and the ethics of others with the hope of getting paid. He told himself, in his mind, it was okay to twist the truth just a little bit because God knows we're all supposed to prosper, aren't we? Doesn't the Bible say we should all prosper? Well, he thought he should prosper. What motivates you when the financial pressure is on? What motivates you when pressure is on? The decision to sell yourself out for money is usually driven by some type of fear that God won't supply your need. The once mighty man of God, Balaam, sold out the believers for the lure of easy money. He broke down God's people through illicit sex. It happens all the time in churches. All the time. All the time. Maybe you saw a church near you blow up because of a leader with loose morals. Because sex and money are big motivators. Big. The error of Balaam is greed at everyone else's expense. This error of Balaam is Jude's second warning. Now perish in the gainsaying of Orig. The way of Cain was jealousy. So deep that you're willing to kill for it. The error of Balaam was greed so deep you're willing to trade your morals and risk your life for it. But this one is a bit different. It's a power grab. And it will take backbiting and bullying to a whole new level. You've all seen this. Verse 11, woe unto them, for they've perished in the gainsaying of Orig. Orig, or Korah, Korah, as the Old Testament calls him in number 16, was a first cousin of Moses. A first cousin of Moses and Aaron and Miriam. So which makes him what? Family. He was family to Moses. He was also a Levite, a specially chosen and well-respected servant to help Moses lead the children of Israel. But Corey didn't want to be on the setup crew. He felt he could do more than be an ordinary Levite. He wanted what Moses had. He wanted to be top dog. Top dog. You know, he had witnessed the miracle of Moses splitting the Red Sea. He saw how manna appeared every morning to feed millions. He also saw how people loved and respected Moses and Aaron. He wanted it. He needed it. He's got to have it. So he started talking quietly at first, gathering support. Corey slowly started turning people against Moses, who had recently received the 10 Commandments and was implementing laws for the children of Israel to live by. Corey eventually turned 250 top Hebrew leaders against Moses by incrementally turning them against the word of God that Moses spoke. Give that a second to sink in. He ended up getting thousands of people killed whose minds were beginning to see things his way. Thousands. Back to Jude's short letter. Jude's third point is open rebellion from within the ranks of a very small fellowship. These people who met in the homes around dinner, not huge mega ministries with $500,000 a year salaries, that's who we're talking about. There were lies, backbiting, gaslighting, twisting the word to fool people, and turning good people against each other for attention or because they liked it the old way. Ultimately, it's rebellion against new light. It's rebellion against new light. It's using an older, twisted version of truth to make waves. The gainsaying of Corey is simply turning people against the leader by twisting Scripture. It was bad enough that Christians were being persecuted and hunted down by the Romans and Judean religious leaders. The backbiting of Corey was tearing the fellowship up from the inside. The theme in Jude is to be careful who we allow into our homes and hearts. Their words will either heal and bless us, or they will rip a hole in the belly of our ship and sink us. Most people don't see it, but all three of these warnings really include an attack on the Spirit of God. It always comes down to the spiritual. Cain was jealous of his younger brother's tight spiritual connection with God, so he killed him. Balaam was willing to sidestep the Spirit of God on him because of his secret lust for riches. And Corey really, really wanted Moses' job, to be the spiritual leader of all of God's people. He thought that by turning people against Moses and getting Moses to doubt his gift, he would then have the power. So be aware of envy, greed, and backbiting, and the spirits that drive them in your church, your fellowship, or your ministry. That's the lesson of Jude. Now the lesson of James. Now this one's quick. First, who was James? Like Jude, James was also a brother of Jesus. There was nobody on earth like James. Even more than Jude, James became the central leader of the early Christians. Peter deferred to him. Paul and Barnabas sought his counsel. He was the big name. James wrote a letter that was longer yet more personal, more reflective, more eloquent than Jude. He too circulated his letter and had it hand copied, fellowship by fellowship, a full 10 years before Paul began to write. Where Jude was in your face, James was in your heart. Both are necessary. The spotlight of James's letter is not on the evil that surrounds us, but rather on how we need to take God personally, how we need to use our faith, utilize the gift of Holy Spirit, and help others. Where Jude is reproof and correction, where Jude is reproof and correction, James is really just doctrine. So the theme verse of James is James 1:22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. This brother of Jesus wants us to ask ourselves, do my actions reflect my faith? Am I a doer of the word or just a hearer? Am I all talk or am I action? James teaches us that faith is not supposed to be abstract. Faith or belief should be real world, real time. James taught us that our belief system should impact every area of our lives and should show up in everything we do. What you believe, others should be able to see. Paul calls it fruit of the Spirit. And James tells us that if our faith is true, we will use it to help others. He covers the same points as Jude, but in a much softer, gentler, more practical way. True faith and pure believing will endure in the midst of any personal hell. The words of James are so simple they explain themselves. I'll show you. James 1:3, the testing of your faith will show off your patience. 1:8, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. 13, God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. You recognize any of these? You know, verse 17, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. 19, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath or anger. Verse 21, receive with meekness the engrafted word which is able to save your souls. 22, be doers of the word and not hearers only. Verse 19, 2:19, thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils also believe and tremble. Now, chapter 2, verse 20 and 26, twice James said, faith without works is dead. 3:2, if any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. In other words, if you can control your words, you're in control of your life. You know, wasn't it manipulated words that caused all three of the problems in Jude? It was. Chapter 3:15, worldly wisdom is earthly, sensual, and devilish. 4:2, ye have not because ye ask not. Could it be any simpler? 4:7, submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The devil's powerless against the word you take a stand on. In fact, the whole universe is programmed to respond to the word. Verse 8 of chapter 4, draw nigh unto God and he will draw nigh to you. The closer you move to God, the more you will notice his abundance moving toward you. 5:12, but let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. When you say yes, mean it. When you say no, mean it. 5:16, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Look how many great quotes are in James. The early believers memorized the words of Jude and James. They memorized them. These two letters were all the believers had for 10 of the first 20 years of Christianity. Put both letters together and you'll not only notice the attacks, but you will stand far above them. So what have we learned? The letters of James and Jude helped thousands of believers stay alive when death knocked at the door. When others quit, and when they began to doubt why they believed what they believed, and when they were hungry. Today we have 27 books in the New Testament that are each necessary to help us live like the sons of God we are. For much of the first 20 years after Pentecost, all the believers had was the two letters from James and Jude. They had to be good. Their letters can still help you make it through the day and want to wake up tomorrow. If you feel attacked by people who love you, if you feel you're losing the control you once had, if you're afraid to say what you really want to say because it doesn't fit with popular opinion, if society or your church is trying to mold you into something you don't want to be, if you've ever worried about God meeting your need, if you're jealous, if people are jealous of you and talking behind your back, if you've ever been afraid for your life, James and Jude are the books for you. Jude's brief letter describes men at their worst and God at his best. James teaches us how to be our best. Envy, greed, and backbiting get our minds off of God and onto worldly things. But no matter what craziness is going on in this world of ours, or within our own heads, we can handle it. No matter what fears we have, we can handle it. No matter what you think you're missing out on, you can handle it. Just like the believers of the first century, we too suffer the aftershocks of war, riots, hate, separation, backbiting, fear, control, and overreaching government politics, people on edge, depression, and natural disasters. James and Jude can still help us today. These words helped the first Christians be alert, stay alive, stay together, and keep the faith for 2 decades. at least until Paul, Peter, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and John picked up the pen a few years later. James and Jude gave us the perfect words for imperfect times. God bless you all.